Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is another talk on logic, talk, thought, and emotion. What is logic? What is thought? What are their relationships to words, rules, and emotions? So, I've been giving a couple of intro talks on logic. As usual, as I try to talk these things out, I do like to talk. So, hey, logic. Of course, logic would not just be talking, it would be talking and listening, but that's not so much formal logic as we'll get to. We have time for forms later. So, first, a bit informally, we've been talking a bit, I have, to you, about what logic is and what I like about it and how I like several examples of logic in different cultures, Indian and Greek and Chinese culture. I have a lot of videos, and then we'll get more up about all of that. Please watch my videos on Indian, Greek, and Chinese logic and other philosophy. But I left off in the intro logic talks, and again, I did mention I am taking my time talking this stuff out a little bit because these are ideas I tend to like, and they're ideas I think are very valuable for people, especially given the times, but also, honestly, the times they're not a changing that much because human beings are very much human beings, and they do remain so. It's always good to remember, of course, this is very human, and then also, well, there's changes, and then what can we do with what we can change? So, that being said, I left off a little bit on object permanence and their babies, and then they use words. Now, there's a subject in here I've been interweaving. I have been very interested in not just Lewis Carroll and the connection between Lewis Carroll and Wittgenstein and how they set up fictions and thought experiments, which are very popular in American thought, philosophy, and many other things, of course, the sciences. Think of a room, think of a unicorn. Okay, so let's say there's a fire. Okay, so let's say just setting up any imaginary example in your head. And I like that idea a lot. Of course, it's something everybody's done plenty. People have been setting up examples seriously, just one-offs, probably, since time immemorial and before human writing and recording. But there are major pieces. I have been arguing that logic is, from a Wittgensteinian point of view, putting several pieces together and interweaving several things, one of which is words, together as thought. Now, a lot of the underlying lesson there, and I have been taking my time and, again, taking great tangents. But one of the main lessons there is that a lot of people try to boil down logic to a form of words or math and math here is very much number words and arrangements of number words and symbols, although math is not entirely an exactly language. It is very much working with a lot of what language is, and including number words. I have argued math somewhat appears when human beings start regularly, at least we can say, using 2, 3, and 5, and that may have been actually very recent, only a few thousand years, some say with specialized labor. It's hard to know, though, because we don't know how much oral cultures before writing had numbers, or had... Well, before literacy, how much do people need math? And people definitely need and have math and literacy as they settle down into city-states. Now, I'm going to teach Indian and Greek and Chinese logic, and then modern logic. But before we do all of that, and these talks are also for the Lewis Carroll folks, but for everyone, because I'm doing all of that this semester, I want to talk for a second, and I'm going to get to Poe as a very special subject, but I actually want to talk about a subject that I've been very interested in. And I got the idea somewhat from Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I have been interested in Lewis Carroll and Wittgenstein and what informal logic, which would be what formal logic is, but could be more of as human thought and reasoning, and how does all that work? Some people, like Boole, wanted to boil logic down to equations. That doesn't work perfectly. Later, Wittgenstein suggests in his later work, maybe we don't boil logic down to simply forms of math or what have you, they would be forms of life. But for a lot of people, that's still kind of wishy-washy, and it's just kind of everything and nothing. So it's very important to flesh out the pieces and say, so why is that a better view of logic, to see words as intertangled in one level and one intertangling of behaviors in life, and not the bedrock basement level? And I'm going to give you more lectures on Wittgenstein. So I'm not going to argue all that out perfectly, maybe never will, right now. But what I am going to talk about, I have already been talking about something of a little bit almost of a more Nyaya view, although I'm not strictly in line. I like the Buddhists and skepticism a lot, so I'm not strictly in line with the Nyaya. But the Nyaya logicians of India say that we weave several things together, primarily perception, and mostly perception is not wrong. And that's actually very true. Gautama and his Nyaya school that follows him says most of the time you do not look at objects in your world and they float away and they don't behave reasonably. So you don't really need rules. It's just most of the time hairbrushes behave like hairbrushes, and you just don't really think much about it. But then you have other higher things that you then use in conjunction with that, like reasoning with words and concepts, as they and others would say, such that you're not just perceiving things, you're using words and imagination to make thoughts about the things, and then we do good or worse thinking, which is what the Indian logicians and Aristotle in Athens and others are concerned with. How do we argue well, given we perceive, and Aristotle's very into perceiving examples and what many call the natural sciences, and so are these folks. If we perceive fire, what do we say and argue about it, given we primarily perceive fire, and fire isn't primarily a verbal form or an argument, which is actually something you have to point out to people occasionally, funny enough. So Gautama of India does tell us sensations can be wrong. What looks like smoke might in fact be dust kicked up from horses. We actually have this example comes up in ancient Greece as well. And after there could have been crossover between India and Greece and philosophers both places, but we do not know that concretely, that it was passed one way or the other, this thought. But we find the example of perception is solid, so is testimony. Somebody says, hey, I know this, but of course you can't trust everybody, and you can't completely trust your eyes entirely either. So you have, for the Indians, so it could be smoke, it could be dust kicked up from horses. Obviously, people in Greece and India came running with buckets, and it turns out it was horses, hopefully not a stampede, and nobody's house was on fire. This happened enough times that perception was wrong. A mirage is another example that comes up a lot. In Greece and in India, either the heat or something on the water or on the sea that is a deception. I used to watch Mr. Wizard as a kid growing up in the 80s. There's the bent straw in the water glass. It looks bent right in front of you, but it's not. And so you can see how you can't trust your eyes, or rather through one medium of air and one medium of water, and both through the medium of glass, light and the vision appears differently and is bent. The Greeks had oars and said oars appear bent in the water, said Greek skeptics. So actually we have ancient people saying, well, you can't trust your eyes entirely. And we all know, yes, because there's optical illusions. And then people have all kinds of thinkings about miracles, rules of logic, math, lots of stuff we can see and not see. And notice a lot of that stuff is what controls or is interacting, that is somewhat invisible, with what we can see. So when trying to figure out what are the forces behind things, of what we can see, fire, the mind, we have a lot of talk in the ancient world about not only ancient physics in India and Greece and China, but logic. And so we have folks, as soon as there are major cultures of writing, there seem to be major philosophers saying that eyes and ears can be mistaken. So observation, and then working through this with talk and argument in the mind. So as people are doing this is again along, well, Western culture is nice, but it's human, and hopefully we're all more logical, and that doesn't even guarantee with enough lawyering that we're good. That you have many complex plays with this, and you have even in Plato says, and it's quite fascinating, he mentions, and the ancient world seems to somewhat understand this, your lower senses, like touch and taste, have to be directly in contact with things. Your nose can smell things from across the room, let's hope not too much. Your ears can hear things from across the yard, but your eyes can see things from all the way down the horizon. But what can see Paris, France right now that your eyes can't see? The mind. So, or thought, the mind, all of that, or something. Dreams? What is that entirely for us or ancient people? I often say mind. I like mind. I like Zen. I think mind is a very nice, simple word. And it doesn't necessarily step on anyone's beliefs, actually. You can believe in religion, you can believe in science, and believe that what we're using right now is mind. But that is to be inclusive. But there's a lot of people of India, Greece, and China who have said, wow, it is mind. Okay, what is that? And of course, they thought it was something like living fire, and then that is polytheism, monotheism, lots of things. But we can actually dovetail with their beliefs and their greater thoughts and say, well, they have their beliefs, we have ours. And yet we, of course, can find great thoughts and concepts, including how do we talk through logic? What is all of that? What place do words and judgments, and what is a judgment? Does it always involve words? Does it always involve emotions? So I have been talking, of course, with words and a bunch about words. I have also been talking a lot about objects. I've been snapping my fingers and talking about various things. I've been enjoying snapping my fingers a lot lately. It is just, you could use any example. It's a simple, nice, clear example, and happens to have you need to be trained to do it, like understand a word, and then it seems exactly the same, like the word horse. But it's always individual, but we're very, oh, that's the same word, the same snap, kind of creatures in how we mean things, understand things, use language and the mind, words, emotions, objects, all together. The imagination, memory, etc. So, in interweaving all these different things together, I want to talk for a second here also especially about Poe and feelings. Because not only have I left a little bit of my heart always in San Francisco, I grew up in the very dead middle of it, so in the Haight-Ashbury, a little bit of love and a little bit of the hate. It is always, again, and not trying to hate at all, as a guy coming from the hate and then from, been living in Berkeley now for a little while, it has always fascinated me with, I definitely know that hippies are loving, but people, you know what I mean? So I definitely, and of course, kids of kids of kids, definitely are cynical of their parents. But at the same time, I will always have a sunny spot for hippies. And hippies are somewhat romantic. They're somewhat touchy-feely, you know, a little bit, if you let them. And so with all of that, there's a lot about feelings and romance and existentialism, and a lot of times people take that as wishy-washy and kind of like indeterminate. And there are definitely reasons how our feelings are kind of indeterminate and all over the place. But there's a couple of things about feelings that are actually really worth mentioning, that are very, in a sense, not to deaden it, behavioristic. When you say behaviorism, and it sounds like 1950s, we put pigeons in a box heartlessly, or we say you don't have emotions, you're a robot, or you function that way, it is definitely in line with functionalism, somewhat pragmatism. But of course, B.F. Skinner, if you listen to him, and actually I got some of his stuff, I put it aside to read. He does say, of course, and I know there's interesting things about him, it is not, there's a little fly fluttering around. My cats will be happy to find it, and hopefully the fly will be happy to find its way away from the cats. As with feelings are very determinate. We have particular feelings. In fact, I have been reflecting a lot on how much we read others to find feelings in them, and how much of our understandings in the world are built out of our own feelings and the feelings of others. Now, that's not so touchy-feely, and in fact, ironically enough, and my family is more the psychology kind of hippies. If they're sort of hardlining, they're not hardlining hippies, but sort of more the psychology neck of the woods. I know there's a lot of people who are into horoscopes. My parents never really encouraged me to be into horoscopes, even though they were more on the progressive end in I grew up in the 80s. And again, they're open-minded, think cultures are amazing. They were sort of more pro kind of education, modern science, definitely. I have all my feelings about that. I share openly, which are not really good or bad. They're just, I try to say that's very much where we are a lot as a culture, and what does that mean? Sort of modern, secular, not really post-religious, because it is still very much a religious world, but what does all of that mean to you and I, and what do we do with the institutions and beliefs of our life, very openly? Which is existential, postmodern, and all of that. But at the same time, in being into psychology and kind of behaviorism and things like that, and actually psychoanalysis turning to Gestalt theory, which is kind of behavioristic. Gestalt, how do you interpret? How does all the pieces weave together? And Gestalt is very informed by Eastern philosophy, Wittgenstein, things that I really love. So given all of that, it's very interesting to say a couple of things about what roles emotions play consistently in thought, which are very obvious, and which I'm not going to say the last word about at all, but which are a much more Wittgensteinian point about something that Poe says about card games, which I mentioned in the last talk. So sensations are feelings, but there are very particular powerful feelings that are kind of tactile. Our emotions are very tactile, but of course our emotions are so bound up in our motivations that really they're not just physical sensations. They are psychological modes of mind, as well as, of course, you can feel hot when you're angry. But, of course, it isn't simply, and has been identified in ancient times with certain sights and sounds and heat, and that's important, and it's interesting. And we'll talk something about that a little. But that this is something like a mode of mind. Now, Wittgenstein says, and I mentioned, don't treat these as interior states. And I'll mention another thing about that here. But your emotions are what you have and what you are, and then people look at you and you look at others and you see they have emotions, and you and I are creatures that very much have emotions when others have emotions. We are very sympathetic whether or not we want to be. In fact, the meanest of us usually hide away from others because we can't help but feel emotions in others. That's actually Poe's Detective Dupin, and again, I'm going to call him by the American pronunciation, Dupin, as I mentioned, for reasons, again, I'll get into. But he has to stay away from others. He's like Sherlock Holmes, but instead of being oblivious to others' emotions, he's so empathetic, he has to hide away from others and just go out at night and is a weirdo. What he says in that story, and I have been looking at Poe's detective stories, and I've been very inspired, even in the first pages of the first one. I thought to myself, wow, 2 or so years ago, this is something I have to slow down and pay attention to, and I have been very happy that I did. And I'm looking forward to doing more talks all about that, of course. But all I'm going to share right here and try to conclude the thoughts I've been ranting about for the last couple of talks. I took 2 talks to do the first lecture. I'm doing 2 to do this. I'm going to talk out for another little while here and try to conclude the intro talks, and then you can get on to the Egyptian, the Indian, the Greek, and the Aristotle, and I'm going to do more of that, and the Chinese stuff. But I'm going to talk about what role here in particular that emotions and motivations play in our lives. I'm specifically going to talk about feeling good, bad, tense, and calm. Those 4. Good, bad, tense, and calm. I am very well aware we feel all kinds of things other than that. But we very powerfully feel, I would say, combinations towards specific things in other people of good, bad, tense, and calm. And then how much that endures or doesn't, or how much that is or not what we read in others as their motivations, in their faces and their actions. And we've been doing long before literacy or even, it's arguable, math words. We've clearly been reading others' emotions before we had words for 2, 3, and 5. I think that's highly arguable, which means the human brain has been reading feelings in others' faces before symbols. That's very possible, very possible. But I would say that's quite evident, or expectable. But let me interweave these with not just my speculations about anthropology, which isn't my field. Let me tell you more of a Poe and then a bit of Wittgenstein about that, as to what role I'm definitely going to be putting emotions into. And that helps me make sense of a lot of the formal and informal logic that we're going to be getting into. And this is not unprecedented, but because Wittgenstein in his later work is very preoccupied with a small number of feelings. One of the feelings that he mentions is the feeling things fit. And another is the feeling that things are odd, that they are, as a guy who was probably a bit closetedly gay, he says queer in the English, which of course has a particular connotation. So I often say odd. But of course, you understand all the connotations of all of that, and I'm not going to make, go on the social commentary. In fact, that's also not my field, queer theory, and I will let others, do their thing. So, that said, there are ways where, what is the feeling that things fit, and what is the feeling that things are odd? Well, without hardlining it, I do now think that something like you're at a card game with Dupin, the proto-Sherlock Holmes of Poe, and you are watching people, and you have interests, and you know that other people know that you have interests, and other people have interests, and they're working with you and against you in a card game. This is a model. This is not a perfect model, but it is a decent one for my purposes here. And it's Poe's. But not only are you reading people to see what combinations of good, bad, tense, and calm they feel in order to figure out what they're going to do, and which emotions and how many they're feeling and to what extent about what. But you are also feeling combinations of good, bad, tense, and calm about things such that things feel they fit or feel odd, and that is a lot of what we actually feel out in doing math problems, physical explorations, science, much more so than following anything like rules. What Wittgenstein basically says, if we're using our whole mind to figure out each situation, then actually I'm relying on the shifting around not only of reading my emotions and your emotions as far as do I feel good or bad or tense or calm about these things. And I'll talk only for a moment because you are already well familiar with these emotions in others. So when I go over what these emotions do, they do all kinds of things, but it's very obvious what these emotions do. They stand out very powerfully, and we look for them in others and ourselves even. We can wash our own hands to see if they're shaking and tense. Or like, they're calm. We could even do that because of the complexity of the situation, but because we're looking for, we don't often look at our own hands, as Wittgenstein says, so we could just stop and be like, am I tense? I don't know. But we might even talk about it with our friend. I don't even know how tense I am right now. We could even, because while we're feeling our own emotions, we're looking for them in ourselves and others and making comparisons and reading things. And actually, if you neglect emotions and say subjective bias in logic, what Poe, Carroll, and I would argue later Wittgenstein are arguing very much is that, and this fits into Wittgenstein saying things do or don't fit, which is math problems and logic. The end of an argument, the end of a math problem, is not just feelings. It is the interweaving of feelings and number words and all sorts of things, mountains, cats. But if something's going to conclude and be a thought for you and others, in some way you're trying to find something that feels it fits as opposed to feels odd. And that would have to do with resolution, emotional resolution, and you are trying to find that yourself, enlightenment, but also in this math problem, but you're also trying to figure out how to resolve problems with others and what makes others tense and calm. And I'm not solving any of this, of course. And we can certainly say this is a big hippie mess of emotions. And we can certainly say there's many more emotions than that. But stop for a second and think about, and I have to say, if you stop and try paying attention not only to your own behavior, but other people's behavior, and figure that you're always somewhat feeling a little bit good, bad, tense, and calm, all together, all overlapping, and that these orient towards different things and shift around, you may be able to actually figure out your own understandings and other people's understandings better. That is a tentative hypothesis of mine. I think actually if you read Dupin, I variously say the name, feel it out, feel it's odd, go back, because my pronunciations don't fit entirely. But I do think that actually a lot of logic has to do with orientations of those four overlapping feelings towards things, and that has to do a lot with understanding and semantics. Now that's a big lot to chew, but it's actually very simple, and I'm going to work on these ideas, but it actually has things to do with what I'm going to use to explain Poe and Carroll, and then later Wittgenstein a lot after we're done with the nuts and bolts of Indian and Greek and Chinese logic. And trust me when I say, well, if you want to skip over and go to that, that is fine. In fact, you can watch these lectures as you like. I think there's a thing or two here I can say about these feelings that I want to say before I get into the rest of it. And I did include in my talks on logic the last time I gave logic, and the students did enjoy the lecture, and I've been adding other thoughts, which is why I've been taking my time. So Poe says a lot of things in his detective stories, but one of the things that he does consistently say is that he worries that city people, which is where the science and where all the magic happens, that he worries in the 1800s, and think Dickens was one of Poe's favorite authors, Dickensian London. It took me a while actually to realize Dickensian means Dickens-ish. So Dickensian London is Soot and Orphans because that's Charles Dickens' London, which Charles Dickens had a big heart, and he's like, I feel for the orphans and I need to tell their story sweetly in very sappy ways for the average person, and then the average person considered him genius. Poe also thought he would write for the intellectual and the average person, so he needed to use real broad brush strokes and push real big buttons. I always like to say, he says, so I bury girls underground a lot, because people really feel that like heck. And so he knows that he's pushing psychological, emotional buttons, sort of like a behaviorist. Sort of like he knows that the public and the intellectuals have death, women, as big buttons you can punch. So punch those buttons, death and women, and then make art by punching giant buttons in people. Think industrialization, factories. He actually would have loved something like the internet and YouTube. I'll get into with Poe, but he wanted cheaper ways of copying because he wanted ideas to get out cheaper to people. It's a little sad because, of course, well, now they do, but you need a phone or a screen sort of, but he wanted to figure out how to get, because printing is expensive. Software, actually, and the internet have somewhat changed that, and the economics of all that a little. But we're going to stick just to the emotions here, and I'll get to Poe's bio, at some other time. But Poe does say, if you look at a chess master and you think, wow, this chess master is the most brilliant guy ever, that guy's good at chess, but he says you need to be good with emotions and words. You need to be both a poet and a mathematician, he actually says. So you could say math, but in a certain sense, what he seems to mean is the head and the heart. To be a true genius, you have to be both a rational and emotional genius. He very much would have thought of it in certain sorts of more so Greek terms, in a sense. He had an education, is that he would have thought something like Plato's heart versus Plato's head, or something like the mind and the heart. Of course, I like mind as mind is. All of that all together. But something like, people say rational intelligence. I'm increasingly going to say something like you need to have both good work with the emotions and good work with words, and that includes number words. I'm making this very simple on purpose. If that seems like it's dumbing it down, I don't think it is. We have regular ways of using emotions in our lives. As children, we're not that regular or that disciplined. But as we have regular ways, we experience being happy and sad and tense and excited and also calm, which is either good calm or depressed, and all of that, the combinations of these. And we read them in children, we read them in adults, we're reading them in adults as children. It has to be something really simple for a child to do and just be in order to line up with the adult and click into patterns before knowing language. So a lot of understanding is actually how we're emotionally conditioned in terms of good and bad, intense and calm towards things, and how we expect others to expect us to be conditioned. And then that's also interwoven with words. This is actually why you would not find logic in words and math alone. You would find them in concrete situations. Wittgenstein says this, and I really love fleshing this all out with a bit of Poe and a bit of Carroll, which is basically what I am doing, but I'm doing it by saying we have at least 4 overlapping interactive emotions, and those connect us up with things and others. And we are looking for that as well as objects, as well as words, in order to understand and think through our world. Thinking using emotions, words, all of that tangled together. I would say you're not just using your words, you're using your emotions, the emotions of others, you're thinking about objects and all of that as you are doing thinking. So emotions, of course, would have a great deal of the role of drawing things together, although we don't think we love cups so much we see them as individual objects. So it's not love necessarily or anything that would bind a cup together as a cup. So it isn't just anything unitive in the mind is emotional. That's actually something you hear some philosophers say. This is not that emotion is the basement level of the mind, because that actually doesn't fit Wittgenstein. This is to say that emotion is one of the central things of the mind, along with, then, words. Now, emotions do come before words. We very well probably feel good, bad, tense, and calm in the womb. It's easy to think. It's just in the womb we've never seen anybody's face. We're not starting to socialize with it. I do recommend Alison Gopnik's The Philosophical Baby. I like that book if you want to think about what is thinking in a baby. And then after that, as we start 2 and 3, getting into trying to integrate these feelings and adult feelings and words pass back and forth all together. And doing that well or poorly is not only using words well logically, but how could you give an argument well if you don't know what good is or feel your audience feels what's good? And there's long talks about it's not just making your audience feel good, but truth is not truth unless it lands and it hooks and it sticks. There are long arguments here, and many would say, no, it's statically pure and Kantian. You're a fool. And I won't prove that now, but we'll keep talking. Yes? So yes, this is the view, again, to put it very simply and basically. Some say logic boils down to rules and mathematical forms. Later, Wittgenstein, in Philosophical Investigations, and also on Certainty centrally, but throughout his later notebooks, suggests this is wrong because it is a tangle of diverse elements. And I am arguing here that because Poe says we're reading people who feel good, bad, tense, and calm in combinations at a card game, that is very seriously part of what Wittgenstein is talking about as the tangle of logic when we are arguing things feel odd or feel they don't fit. We might never do a math problem or ever seek a grade ever if things didn't feel they fit or feel odd, and we are mammalian again. So Poe says a lot about this, and think about the back and forth between saying and meaning things. There's a lot in Carol about saying what you mean and meaning what you say, feeling the words and the words being felt. Understanding does not simply boil down to feelings, but much of what understanding does boil down to simple feelings in ourselves and others. It's not just that, and emotions are not subjective private experiences, because you can see Sally get pissed off and you say, wow, I'm sorry you're angry. So no, anger is not an inner emotional state for Wittgenstein. It is a bodily mental state, and it has been in all cultures the whole time. There's a lot of Wittgenstein here. We could play act at not being angry in cultures. We're going to leave all that. Just understand, generally, you do look at people, and not just like the Nyaya say, where it's generally we're not wrong about objects, and then there's optical illusions. Generally, we are not that wrong about people's emotions, or we don't have the time to know that we are. I see somebody angry, they're angry. I feel angry, I was just angry. And then we forget about it or do whatever. There isn't much room here for error, but that's not that we're such objective truth machines. It really is more, but what would you expect a human being to do other than walk down the street, see someone angry, feel angry, go on with their life? These are simple elements to us. They have been simple elements to you. It's, again, hard to say as a child before language, but certainly with language, you haven't had an easy time with emotions. But you have been, had clear emotions in ways, and your parents have discouraged and encouraged this in you emotionally. All of this, again, predates actually Nietzsche, and then that predates Freud, actually. And I've already said, Wittgenstein is very behaviorism rather than psychoanalysis. So that is me ranting, actually, through the beginning part of this. That is very much the notes I have on some of that. There is a book, I already mentioned Are We Born Racist in another of the talks. What we actually know, and is very good if you do care about racism, and I do, that's in ways that we are tribal, or we understand these or that people are frightening or a threat. If your parents act frightened around certain sorts of people and they never say anything about it, you will learn to be frightened of those people, because you're actually soaking up their fear reactions towards this or that people or not, and reading their faces as and before you learn to use words. So what the book Are We Born Racist, which is many different small, short essays, I like it, I suggest it and recommend it. What a lot of those essays do suggest is that we should not, any of us, feel totally bad for being conditioned to be the way we are. We are, of course, hopefully each of us going to say, well, maybe I'll be a bit wiser, try to live a bit better. It does highly suggest, I won't go on and on about that book. I have a lot to say about the things in that book. There's a particular moments in that book I find highly valuable. But you don't have to feel bad that you and your parents have been conditioned the way they are. We're all conditioned and we're all too human and mortal. And usually I find that people don't really need you to be perfect ever. If they do, don't worry about those, few number of people, because it's always within any group a few number of people who would ever demand absolute perfection, and they'd be wrong, out of anybody. So I wouldn't worry any group of people or you or anybody else really needs all that much perfection. Usually people want a bit better out of somebody, and so no matter who you're talking about, go out, try to do better if you can, hide from who's ever trying to kill you when that's what's going on. But what I would do is go out, try to be better, and just try to live a better life, because that's the best you can do. So in pointing these out, I am not being accusatory and saying, well, people should feel bad about themselves. But if you want to change, if you want to know, well, then how else are you going to do it? So we are conditioned to fear certain kinds of people. Sometimes that's right. Sometimes that's wrong. Sometimes that's beneficial for the child to fear certain kinds of people. And then we are learning to have tense reactions towards certain kinds of people. And then we learn anything like nice or mean words. So we actually, in a certain sense, see people be nice and mean and react as people being nice and mean as children and as adults, and we're learning all that as we're learning to talk. Of course, we're hearing words the whole time. It is preferable now to give the baby more consciousness in language than people did before, and that's good. And I will leave that to those experts. So if we are reading others for emotions, and if we specifically, I think, are reading people for I think that our emotions feel good, bad, tense, and calm all the time. And I think our emotions read people, and then we are only partly aware of our own emotions. But those emotions are conscious. They're not actually psychoanalytic subconscious emotions. I do subscribe very much to the Wittgensteinian arguments, and he is kind of anti-Freud. Why would we feel feelings we don't feel? or think thoughts we can't think secretly. The burden of proof would be on those to show that we do. And unfortunately, repressed emotion sounds nice, but that would be feeling feelings we can't feel. And there's problems with feeling things we can't. You'd never be able to have proof of it. You'd never be, because if you felt it, well, then why was it now not? Well, I guess then you have feelings you don't feel. Maybe neurology finds those, and neurology, as far as I know, has yet to find psychoanalytic concepts, or anything. Now, are those concepts of psychoanalysis built out of feelings or words or images? Jung, of course, has us have deep-seated sort of images or something almost, although I'm not the Jungian and I don't know the latest about that. And people have to interpret Jung. They have different interpretations. Jung very much almost suggests like we have an image of motherhood. I did study a little bit of Buddhist psychology with Eleanor Roche in Berkeley. I had the good fortune, and she is famous for prototype theory. You early on get an image of a bird, probably not a penguin, could be a penguin. In your mind, that's now birds, very much. That's fine, and that's good. This is sort of dealing with all of that, a bit. In a certain sense, we're having all the emotions at the same time, a little bit, and then more and less, and then we use that, I would say, to feel others' emotions. How do you project others' emotions? You feel emotions, in a sense, as them kind of across the room, as emotions. And then you can feel about those emotions, their emotions, which you would use, if you're feeling them at all, your own mind and emotions. Like if you're thinking somebody's thoughts, that's you thinking their thoughts. So if you're feeling somebody's feelings, that's you feeling their feelings as your feelings, whether or not you feel their feelings are good or bad. And I'm not going to pretend to sort all that out here. I hope there's actually a lot of talk and good talk about how we feel about feelings, what those processes are. But all I suggest here is probably we're just like this is visual, then this is audible, and this is visible again, and your mind isn't going back and forth. It's the same thing. This is also emotional, but if I'm not calling attention to it, you don't know how good, bad, tense, or calm this is. But then I say, well, pay attention to your feelings. Actually, that's making me tense, please. But you don't have to notice how it's making you tense, just like you don't have to notice a kink in your back, and then I'm screwing my back up. Well, you could be angry, and you're not paying attention to how you're angry because you're staring with your eyes or listening with your ears very carefully, and you're not paying attention to how tense you are. Yes, and how bad and tense, thus plenty angry, you feel. Yes. I am going to pay attention to good, bad, tense, and calm. I am not pretending that exhausts the emotions. I am not pretending combinations of that exhaust hunger, horniness, heat. There's lots of things, of course, that are sensations and emotional and lots of stuff. I am not trying to close it out. I do believe that there are two pairs of very oppositional emotions. I was already, and a lot of philosophy has thought about good and bad, but in studying Indian and Greek and Chinese philosophy, it has dawned on me slowly. One of the big values in philosophy is not excited happy, although that's more Nietzsche. Go out and live a roller coaster life, woo individualism. Many philosophers across human cultures argue for happy calm. Something like enlightenment. It isn't thrilling, and there could be tension in it. In fact, there's lots of interesting Buddhist esoteric stuff about emotional states, lots of concepts and descriptions that I'm not entirely into, but how we have subtle this and that, and of course they're meditating and fasting and feeling all sorts of things and thinking about it, and sometimes it gets lots of descriptions in ways that people don't like, but there's lots of just clear brute psychology and pragmatic talk in a lot of the early Buddhist talks, in which he really is asking people to find the very basic pieces of these things and try to see them all interweaving, which makes him a lot like Wittgenstein. I also recommend Kalupahana's Buddhist Philosophy. That is a book that has influenced me a lot. If you have to read one book on Buddhist philosophy, Kalupahana's Buddhist Philosophy is it, although I warn you, it agrees a lot with me. And as I read it, I'm like, wow, this agrees a lot with me. This is perfect, So it's very Wittgensteinian. So take that, you know what I mean, with a grain or two. So, but if you notice, Aristotle says that people have temporary moods and then they have permanent fixtures. I'm going to get into Lewis Carroll, and in Lewis Carroll, you definitely see it repeated, that tense and calm, and in a sense good and bad. But Lewis Carroll very much has something like being passive and white and overbearing and red, painting the roses red, the white roses red. There's very much of a theme of something like white being the deferential weak child and red being the overbearing adult. And it has something to do with like weakness and fright and overbearing, and you can actually see the queens on either side of Alice attent and then asleep. I definitely am going to argue that is him toying with ideas of Aristotle, because I'm also going to argue there's Aristotle in the rest of the text, because actually Aristotle says there's pale and flushed. Aristotle himself says that there's white and red like Lewis Carroll, and he actually identifies it with emotional states, which means Aristotle, whom many call the father of logic, was, like Poe, like Carroll, and like later Wittgenstein, trying to interweave basic biological emotional states into argument, logic, time, space, and all of the intermixture of all of this, such that while Aristotle did not agree with Carroll, with Wittgenstein about anything, well, he wouldn't have, he didn't know him, but Carroll at least, and then Wittgenstein did not agree with each other about everything, in fact, passionately would disagree. But all of them do think that logic is very human. It's very much about argument, and even though you can understand it and model it with math, you should not cut out basic emotional states. And when you look at the kind of red and white stuff that I'm talking about in Alice in Wonderland, and then Aristotle's, I believe it's primarily in the categories, I'm going to talk a lot about that. In the first book of Aristotle's works on logic, he talks about his 10 categories. I think that shows the caterpillar is time and the Cheshire cat is space, and I'll get into all of that. But it also shows that something like, and the Taoists even have things like that, there are oppositional emotional states for human beings, such as something like being dominated, domineering, and those things do have to do with good, bad, tense, and calm in positions. And if we don't understand those, we don't have logical positions to defend, attack. You would have to have some basic awareness of human emotional positions and situation in time and space, later Wittgenstein would argue, to ever make any argument about anything, including the most abstract and formal of math and logic. But that is a view which very much has its contest against in the Kantian, of course, and neo-Kantian point of view. But think about Pooh, Tigger, Piglet, and Eeyore. I did suddenly find, and I planned it in my Poe videos a while ago, Poe video, I think I may have made slightly more than one. I'm going to make more. There will be. Aristotle says we have temporary emotions. I could feel angry, right? We also have dispositions. I was angry all day Tuesday, right? He also says we can be mad, like the Mad Hatter. And by the way, the Mad Hatter and the March Hare are rude to Alice from the very beginning, which means they're angry and aggressive. They're mad because they're angry. And it's also a joke, also on that. It's a pun on the English as well. They're rude and aggressive, but they're also crazy. They're kind of nice to Alice, but they're also very rude and aggressive, and they're nuts. Alice is also rude to them, in turn, mirroring their behavior. I'll get to that. But what you actually have is they're permanently upset and kind of divisive and stuff against each other, against others. So they're permanently mad and going around in a kind of logical and emotional circle in ways. That can be read in there, but whether or not you read that Aristotle and the Lewis Carroll the way I do, what you can say is Aristotle would say, well, there are, in a certain sense, you have temporary moods, just like everybody else. You have temporary emotions and motives. I am angry, so I do something. I then was angry all Tuesday, so I stayed indoors, did something else. I am, in general, an angry person. These are all things we deal with. We deal with angry people in general. We deal with having angry periods of our lives and people who are angry. And we deal with anger right now, therefore I'm going to do this. Now, we're reading people and we're understanding all of that. And what Aristotle definitely suggests in his work on logic is that's part of the background and interweaving, and background, as Wittgenstein would say, of all of this together. So you don't really have logic unless you have these clear emotional moves. And as I said, I am going to get into how emotional moves in Poe, Carroll, and later Wittgenstein, which is the better work on logic, I believe. Then in going through the basics of formal logic, I will show you why if you try to cut out emotion and you try to cut out situation and make it completely universal, you actually end up with things that are a bit absurd that people have been mocking back and forth like Lewis Carroll, because formal logic is not entirely life. It could be a good modeling language in circumstances. It may not be entirely like life, especially if you try to strip motives or things like emotions, which clearly physically exist and we are trying to get for ourselves and others. If you take those out, you end up with strange formalities that may not reflect our lives or thinking at all. And I've definitely thought that way a long time. I've definitely been more into Nietzsche and Wittgenstein than I have been much analytic philosophy. But the reason that I like Poe, Carroll, and Wittgenstein is because you can say, well, we're such cowardly creatures, and Poe does before Nietzsche. We're such accountants. We have such chicken hearts, such large heads and such small hearts that we can tip right over. And you see that whenever we debate about mathematics and get entirely angry, or logic and get entirely angry at each other, because that's the chicken heart of the mathematician, or I suppose Poe might say analytic philosopher, just tipping over with the size of their brain that isn't balanced out with emotional intelligence, is what he actually seems to be saying. Plato says a very similar thing. In the Theaetetus, he says if people have little hearts and big heads, they just run around all top-heavy. He says that. You don't want to have a big head with a small heart. That's not actually Plato. You might think it is. It's not. So when you think about Pooh Bear is, not that Pooh. Pooh Bear is happy and calm. Sort of like the Buddha. A happy, excited Buddha is freaky. There are happy, excited Buddhas who look like they're on a roller coaster. It's weird. The slight smile of the Buddha, which calmly smiles happily on everyone, is the real point of that. Tigger, I have always been accused of being somewhat the Tigger. I am very manic, which means I'm kind of a happy person, and I also am very tense. And happy and tense mixed together are excitement. But not like for Piglet. See, because Piglet is tense. Now there's Rabbit, there's Owl, there's others. I'm not trying to, and there are, I'm just using these, I don't claim these are a perfect set. They all were from the beginning. But they actually do, of course, serve as good psychological types, which they were kind of meant for children to be so, I suppose. Piglet, oddly enough, is a tense and bad. If he feels bad, he's very, not about everything, but he often feels bad and he feels tense. So he's like Tigger, but he's tense and bad, not tense and good. And then you finally, famously, have Eeyore. And what does Eeyore feel? Bad and calm, which together, calm would not necessarily be the word. I say bad, tense, calm, because tense, calm are single-syllable words. But what is bad and calm? Depressed. I am perfectly happy for a bunch of people to tell me a bunch about depression and mania and all of these things and say I don't know what I'm talking about, sure. But of course, what I'm not actually here trying to do is clinically diagnose you or I or Eeyore, because I'm pretty sure he doesn't exist, and that's good, because he is very sad. But aren't you reading people for people to be like Pooh, Tigger, Piglet, or Eeyore? And don't you read people to see whether or not they are more or less like that on a Tuesday or in their lives in general? I'd actually say not only are you, if you don't take something like that into account, it is very hard to share any activities with anybody. It is hard to learn any kind of math. It is hard to learn any kind of rules. And actually, you could argue very easily, while some would say soccer is composed of rules, it is easy to argue soccer would be composed not just of rules, of the ball, the object, of memories of other games, of physical muscle memories and motions, but it would have to be composed of goals, of things feeling they fit, of things feeling illegal and wrong, way before rules got codified. When the thing was like a pickup game in its infancy, people had to feel the ball goes in either net. Way before anything was written down. The whole game could have been completely illiterate, and yet people feel very much, oh, I'll do that. Way before there was ever a rule. Don't touch the ball with your hands, and don't say you never do, because the goalie does all the time. And this is the moment where people are like, okay, shoot, I'm going to add this to the rule. See, you don't need to. It feels appropriate when the goalie touches the ball. And for everybody else, it was bad. So be careful thinking we have to write out the rules entirely. And when do we? Has FIFA? Not going to make the jokes. I don't. You know what I mean? Don't need anybody coming after me here. So that is very much, in a lot of ways, part of, and a lot of what I want to say about emotional states, which I just mean we are looking for people to be happy and calm, happy and tense, and sad and calm. That's it. And I want to supply that, though, because I do think shifting around of that is feeling things fit, feeling we're pleasing the teacher by answering the math problems correctly, and if anybody says, so you're saying we only think it's 16 because you feel good about it, the world would look differently. There would be no zebras if all we had are feelings. One of the weird things is we're looking through feelings at things, and feelings don't just feel about feelings alone. When have you felt about happiness something and nothing else was involved? Feelings bring things together or hold them apart, don't they? They bring things together and they push things apart. Oppositionally, positive emotion. This is very basic to philosophy and psychology. Positive emotion, negative emotion. A lot. Yes? So, tense is when things need to move. Calm is when things are not going to move. Tense is when things are moving. Bad tense is, oh no, things are moving. Good calm is, all right, things are getting together, or are together, or have been together. Bad calm is things are not going to fit. It's just going to be useless. I feel those feelings all the time. So do you. And I'm a very manic person. You may have told, I like snapping my fingers and telling ridiculous jokes and going on and on and on about logic. And yeah. I do think a lot. We have a culture run a lot by narcissism, and a whole lot of stuff. And we talk about narcissism a lot. Narcissists have manic energy a lot. They can run people into the ground. But it's not just manic energy. It's also not admitting you're wrong and going back and forth. So I know I'm a very manic person and Tigger. So I actually, of course, I hope that I do go back and forth enough, admit mistakes, say, well, I'm just human, and that isn't some kind of setup, because that would be the way that I would be. Being quite manic and positive. Make sure that I'm not being, a little too one-sided just on my side. Hopefully I'm manic and happy. We all have a side, because, a little bit of that one-sidedly goes a long way, And I'm just going to say that, because obviously it's not just one or two people. So I already covered a little bit about, emotions are not these inner mental states. You're not privately having happiness. There is actually, I may as well mention the horrible story, which is interesting, of Freud and his daughter and the strawberry cake, which again sounds entirely questionable, but is awesome to bring up here. Freud notices his daughter one day is like, oh, father, you got me that strawberry cake and I love it. I'm going to have another one today and it's going to be so good. And he has this sudden realization that I've trained my daughter to please me and how I please her. Again, paging Dr. Freud. Don't think about that. Again, basically, I am, as a parent, let's say that I'm Freud. Here's the daughter. Basically, you buy cake for the daughter. The daughter sits in the let's say, and in fact, as it says, they go to a shop in Austria as a Jewish family, possibly a Jewish shop. They go in and they get a treat, a strawberry cake. Freud's daughter is like, when I go in there, she doesn't say all these words to herself, but I have to say them to you to represent all of this. When I go in there, the child is thinking, but not in all these words, because he's conditioned, doesn't need to think it all out, is the weaving of all this. I'm going to go in there, and I get to have a cake, and when I have a cake and I'm happy, my folks are happy. So not only is my happiness getting the cake, I'm making my parents happy when I'm happy. So I'm going to sit here right now and perform, and that's what Freud is saying. My daughter is sitting here telling me, I'm going to have a strawberry cake, Daddy, and I'm going to have it, and I'm going to love it, and it's great. And he's like, she's trying to please me with her happiness. She's actually, and of course, this is sort of a horrible, Freud was not apparently the greatest parent. In this way, this is a touching, loving moment, though, and not that way. Is that, and again, sorry for the subject, it is something you could write for years, about this, and people would spill fancier words. Yes, I'm sure they have. I think Zizek does mention this at some point. I may be stealing kind of his reference to it, and then I got it. I don't entirely remember. I've read a little bit of Zizek, not entirely. Zizek's early work on Lacan is really interesting, and yeah, I'll talk about that later this semester. Zizek, one of the most famous philosophers today, is a Lacanian. That's basically French Freud, in a sense. And then he's also Hegelian. That's German. I can get into that stuff. I won't right here. But basically, what you can see is you're not just having your emotions privately. You're having your emotions, and your emotions are emotional to people all around you, right? You're afraid of looking a certain way or having a look on your face and other people misinterpreting it all the time. So what's happening is, you're having very powerful basic emotional states and revealing and concealing them. Men and women have different strategies, people say, as far as masculine, feminine behavior, which people can behave like in various ways, yes, and I don't judge. Those are characteristic ways of displaying emotion, of being open and closed, of talkative and not, in certain situations that people judge. So people judge men and women and expect certain things out of men and women. Now, if you grow up to be, I am a straight dude, sure ya. That means whether or not I'm simply having my own feelings about myself, I am trying to please the world, whether or not I like it, sort of like Freud's daughter, in that I'm trying to look and be, I'm a masculine man, but I'm also hippie-ish, I can do it my way, that's strong, and it's so strong, so caring. Because I can do it this way, but I also should wear pants, and I should impress people, and yada, 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 and You have all the ways of your life that you're trying to impress people, which is not just fake. There isn't really fake or real here. Lacan says everything is kind of fake as the real, but we'll get to that. That's kind of the pill of the Matrix or not. We'll get into that. But essentially, you are not just having your feelings with Pooh, Tigger, Piglet, and Eeyore. You are also trying to please or react to Pooh, Piglet, Tigger, and Eeyore, all around you. So part of what I wanted to end out, again, this series of intro talks on logic is I've really been thinking about that a lot, especially with Gopnik, especially with Buddhism, especially with Wittgenstein, and the feeling things fit and not, because that's very central to everything for Wittgenstein. Central to philosophy. Think about the unexamined life and that feelings feel enlightened and fit overall or not, and that people have feelings about that like that very much. And that doesn't tell you anything entirely, does it? Think about existentialism and how existentialism feels in the modern world where individually alone can't put it all together and you kind of have to sort of scream out into the void and make meaning for yourself. That is very much a configuration of those kind of things in a simple social situation. All of these things would kind of have to be. I like boiling down philosophy. But unless major philosophies are very simple, kind of emotional, it's not the same two sentences, but something like a situation you can understand, not a paragraph that you memorize. That's not what existentialism is. But a emotional mind state of, in the modern world, the individual, something like that. That would be a philosophy more than something like 17 paragraphs in stone, now you own it. Because if millions of people cannot understand a simple, emotional, verbal situation, which is not perfectly emotional, notice the emotions don't have to freeze exactly in order, nor do the words have to be identical. But if you can flow, if you can move, what Wittgenstein would say is, if you're competent in that situation, interweaving objects, your wallet, your car keys, your car, you're going to park like that, emotions, memories, forget I said anything about it, and words, let's have fewer words in this example, you're not competent at anything. Parking your car, ordering a plane flight, arguing with me about anything. How could you? What are you going to do? Not with me. I mean, how would you use something other than what I'm describing to interweave yourself into your world? Now, there are people who are trying to find, for later Wittgenstein in his later work helped people invent, in his early work, Wittgenstein helped people invent truth tables. He was trying to boil down and an or into concrete mathematical moves that are universal. But what he says in his later work, and what I do realize here is I am going to give another talk here on and an or, which I knew I was going to do that. I wanted to get through most, and in fact, I have gotten a lot through much of this stuff because I have been ranting and raving fully. Well, freely, somewhat. That I am getting very much through the notes, and I have said pretty much what I'm going to say right here, but I'm going to... How and an or work is something that Wittgenstein thought he could make into a kind of mathematical chess move that is universal, such that if we correctly use or and, we should use them, or could in a formal logic, in a static, unchanging way. If you know chess, you know that a knight moves 2 squares up, or 3, 2, yeah. Good chess playing here, right? 4th dimensional. You're on a square, you move 2 up, yes, and 1 over. Now you can go either way, but that's the moves, and then you can do that different ways backwards, and other pieces can only move forward. There's rules, but there's practices also, if there are or not perfect rules. Chess is something where arguably there's almost, if not there are, perfect rules. Given what I just said about soccer, it's arguable. Because you could just have regular practices and they appear rule-like. There isn't actually secret words or concepts deep within you because you're just feeling, I do this out here. You don't have to secretly, you can imagine a new chess move and I do that. But you're actually doing that looking at the board. People do chess in their head. They also do. Wittgenstein says, what if we played chess privately in our head and never had a board? We could, but we like having objects. Makes it easier, doesn't it? Even sending somebody a picture of the board would make it easier. So objects are good, but there are ways where, and I will conclude this right here, and I will pick up on another talk. I have to do some Descartes and other stuff. I am neglecting European philosophy. But I am going to give another short talk here, and I knew I would have to do this one, and I wanted to do it separately, about what effect it seems, definitely, that Wittgenstein was saying, not that emotions have one, but and and or are actually elastic, and it's very easy to give examples of this at a buffet. I have been fascinated with inclusive and exclusive or for a very long time, ever since I was in college. And it fits very well into what I'm saying right here. Actually, you feel out emotionally whether or not and or fits more so or less so in the situation. And there's actually ways you can show that in concrete situations, even if you want to believe that there is simple, pure formality aside from emotion in the structures of the language and the behavior. What you can actually see is, depending on how generous you are or the resources are, or how much you're feeling about it, I would argue, and or are elastic and they stretch to the context and the situation. I've already said the context is the situation itself. And you can see that in concrete examples, like a buffet or like buying a car. I will explain that and my thinking on that in the next talk. And then that will hopefully be a shorter talk. And now I have done the first 2 lectures each with a talk about an hour. But again, since this is, we don't get to talk in person this semester, and it is all online, I am going to put out the material, and hopefully you can watch and enjoy it. And for those of you who have turned in the first assignment, I will be reading that over and getting back to you. So thank you with that, your reflections on what you believe logic is and how it works personally, and then trying to think out your thoughts in a page, which is a hard task, and I just want your general and best ideas as simply, and on purpose quickly as possible, because I want to see what that produces. It's a bit of a Rorschach. Again, your parents fighting, as I always say. So I will get, next time here, to talking about and or, why I'm fascinated with inclusive and exclusive or, why formal logic chooses to use, I mentioned actually a talk ago, or inclusively. Technically, you're always supposed to use in some formal logics, and the one that Wittgenstein helped invent with the truth tables effectively, you're supposed to use or inclusively, but actually we hear and or exclusively and inclusively depending on context, which suggests we would read people and the situation to see how much we can get away with or not, and we definitely use and or. The words are identical, but we understand and hear them differently depending on how people say them. And I am going to argue that, and I will next talk here. So much happiness. Thank you for listening to me. If you are not familiar with logic and philosophy, thank you for listening to my talks, and please listen to others. I will continue with more talks this semester on East Asian philosophy, including Buddhist philosophy and Zen, logic, and I need to get to a couple of modern European philosophy classes such that we can eventually get to the Nietzsche, the Wittgenstein, and the postmodernism, all of which I've been mentioning, I will have in lecture form that you can listen to and watch by the end of this semester. So much happiness, much love, much feelings of happiness and calm. Hopefully you have some feelings of happiness and excitement in your life, but you're probably feeling good, bad, tense, and calm about a lot. Otherwise, you couldn't try to change anything or feel anything was slightly odd or out of place, even if you're in your best moves with all those emotions probably being somewhat there all the time. I will try to point that out a little without being overbearing about that, but thank you for letting me share my ideas with you. Central to Poe, Carroll, and Wittgenstein we're going to get to. And I will see you if I ever see you.